about, at least 35,000 years, the vernal equinox was, and has been for many, many people, the new year. This is the beginning of the year. This is when new life begins to show. This is when that which seemed to be dead is coming to life again. This is when the thoughts and the dreams and the delicious ideas and the plans and the hopes of the deep winter months begin slowly to come into fruition as we begin to be able to act, because the soil is available to us. Some of us have been involved in the Persian Nowruz celebrations in the past week. It always starts the sunset of the day, the 20th, it's like the Hebrew holidays. They start the 24 hours sunset through the following sunset of the day of the equinox, the vernal equinox. And it is the most ancient religious holiday on the planet. Not spiritual, but religious, okay? We'll talk about the difference between religion and spirituality at noon. The Zoroastrians have honored the vernal equinox as Nowruz since at least 1600 BC, and some people say since about 6000 BC. And they have done so out of the understanding, their understanding, that divinity is light. And as we experience more and more light, we are experiencing more and more divinity. So all of the Zoroastrian traditions, which we now see in the Parsi, Persian, some Iran, there's about 250,000 Iran citizens or people from Iran in the US who celebrate Nowruz, and now the Baha'i, which is why it's happening in Florence, because you have a wonderful Baha'i group here in Florence, and are all honoring that particular holiday. Now we know that the Sumerians treated this as the beginning of the year, and the phrase Nowruz means the head of the year. It does not mean start, it means head. And the Sumerians and the people who lived in the Mesopotamian area celebrated or honored the ending of the old and the beginning of the new by taking the fatted calf, cutting off his head, and putting it in the Tigris River, or the Euphrates River, depending on which one they were at. And that was to take away their sins. And that's a huge part of this particular season. Anything that we have done that has separated us from. The word S-I-N in the Romance languages means without. Okay? In English, it means we did something wrong. But if you think of it in the Romance languages as without, I am without divinity, I'm out of balance, I am not centered in what I know to be true. So that's what that's about. So anything that we have done or said that keeps us separated from what we know to be true, keeps us off-center, is what is to be released at this time of year. Now the Hebrews maintained the tradition when they left the river by tying all the little peccadillos, which is another word for the same thing, or peccatoribus, if you're from the Latin tradition. All these little things would be tied on strings of yarn or ribbons to a goat or a lamb, a kid or a lamb, and sent out into the wilderness. That was their way of dealing at this time of year with letting those go, so that everyone, the whole community, because it's the community action, the whole community would be freed of all the thoughts and ideas and actions that separated the members of the community from that oneness, that truth, that oneness. And so the poor little critter would be sent off, the little lamb would be sent off into the wilderness, which is part of why when the Roman Church started to try to interpret the letters of Paul and Peter and John and James, they began to associate the Lamb of God with the one that takes away the sins of the world. And so we have that woven in to this season of the year. The Passover, the Pesach of the Hebrew traditions gets translated into the Lamb of God taking away the sins of the world in the Christian tradition. We go from throwing the calf's head into the river to hanging a man on a cross. There's quite a bit of difference there, but it's the same basic concept. Some notion. It's based on an actually rather juvenile notion. If you remember our spiritual growth, the lower levels include the idea of the Father as, you know, this divine divinity as the punishing parent. And then the next one is, well, if I do the right thing, maybe I can make things right with this punishing parent. Right? And so that's what we're talking about here. That's a stage in human development. So that's been part of this time of year for the Middle Eastern communities, for the people around the Fertile Crescent and the Mediterranean for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. In the temperate climates, as we move up toward Europe, we start to see a different pattern at this time of year. What we see is the return of the feminine. Okay, remember when I was here at the Yule, we talked about the masculine at the Yule. We talked about the old man and the new young god, or the new young male child. And now that's Januarius, that's the Roman tradition. Chronos, the old, is replaced by Chronos, the new. At this time of year, then we had, as we move through from then, we get February, we get Involk, we get the introduction of the feminine in the maiden. And now the maiden is actually going to come into our midst. This is the point of the spring equinox. This is Estera, Austera, Estro, estrogen, hysteria, hysterectomy. It's all the same root. And it also is the name of Austria. I was getting on a plane in Europe one day, and the guy in front of me had his passport out, or next to me actually in line, and it said Österreich. And I went, oh my goodness, Austria is not named after the southern, it's named after who we know as Easter, Estra, Ostera. It's named after the goddess. That's why the Edelweiss is her symbol for Austria. The Edelweiss is the symbol of the goddess, the 5 points, the stars. If you slice an apple with the five seeds, that's the symbol of the goddess. The 5-petaled rose, the symbol of the goddess, the Edelweiss. Anyway. So what we have at this time of year in those parts of the world is her coming into the community. And it's a beautiful, beautiful pageant. And I'll talk a little bit about it at our Easter service in 2 weeks. Easter, Estra, Austria, Ostera. It's all the same. It's wonderful. Anyway, she comes into the world at this time. And as I say, I'll give you more details in 2 weeks. This week is an amazing week. We don't usually think about it because most of us celebrate St. Paddy's Day, the feast day of St. Patrick of Ireland, and most of us wear green, and most of us don't think about anything more than that. But St. Patrick, on the 17th of March, did pass away in Ireland, and it's a fascinating story if you haven't followed up on it. The name Patricius means father of the citizens, father of the people who live here. Now, why would we have an Irish saint come with that name? It's a Latin name. It's very strange. So it turns out he was not named that. He was named Melwyn, and he grew up in Scotland. And then in the constant raids and counter-raids that are going on between the Norse and the English and the Scottish and the Irish and all of these people back and forth, the Angles and the Saxons and everybody, the Druids and the Picts, and he got carried off. He was son of royalty, effectively, in Scotland. And so he got carried off to Ireland, and he was, given the job as a shepherd in Ireland. And he had some familiarity with the biblical stories, and he identified himself with David, the shepherd of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, the great child of God who felt that deep connection with the divine. And as a shepherd, this young mailman began to really feel that connection with the divine. And as he said he prayed hundreds of times a day and hundreds of times at night. It was like almost every moment became a prayer. It was an active life of prayer. And as the time unfolded, he had a dream, and the dream said, go to the seacoast and get on a ship, you can get home. And he found a way to do that, and he did go home back to England or Scotland. He's actually right on that border near the wall. And his family welcomed him. And he said, I need to follow this connection. I need to feel this closeness with the divine. And so they said, well, there's this guy down the way over here who really seems to live that. And he was someone we know is Saint Germain. So this Scottish royal son who spent most of his adolescence as a shepherd is now studying with Saint Germain. And he's turned into even more of a mystic and given a lot of the power, because Saint Germain's an alchemist. And so he's a Christian alchemist. It's very interesting. And so he trains this kid in Christianity and alchemy. And the kid gets this notion that he needs to go back to Ireland, and he needs to bring this to the Irish, and he needs to transform these people. So Saint-Germain sends him down to the Pope, who's his good friend, and the Pope says, okay, we'll do this. Well, no, we won't do this. We'll send so-and-so instead, and so-and-so did botch the job and got killed. Okay, we'll send you. So he changed his name. The Pope changed this Scotsman's name to Patricius. Patricidius, to be precise, and which means father of his people. And he said, go and become the father of these people. These are your people. I put them in your hands. What the Pope at that time wasn't quite aware of was that Patricius's notion of what Christianity wasn't quite the same as the Roman notion. And Saint-Germain had kind of given him some twisted ideas. And so he gets to Ireland and he manages to continue. Remember what I said once before, that Augustine told the church, don't try to impose our way on those people. Adopt and adapt. Adopt and adapt. That's why you always find these wonderful pagan things woven into the Roman church. So Patricius goes back to Ireland, and his first encounter is with one of the tribesmen, heads of a tribe, and the guy tries to kill him, and Patricius is able to freeze his arms so he can't move to kill him. And he won't let the guy move his arm until the guy says, okay, I give up, uncle, right? And so now the guy has turned his power over to Patricius. This was incredibly important in these people at that time, in the Celts. The headman had to turn his power over to you for you to be able to be the father of the people, right? So he did that, and that was the first step. And then we continue to see him working through the country, through Ireland. And there's this legend, as many of you know, of the snakes. I heard that. Well, there have never been serpents on Ireland. Never, ever, never, not so, okay? So how could he have rid the island of the serpents? There's 3 or 4 beliefs of them, and one is that he basically kicked all the Druids off the island and put them on their own island, and that's actually true. There are, Ireland itself is pretty much free of Druidism, and it is pretty much located on 1 or 2 of the islands between Ireland and England. So that's one theory. Another theory that's tied into an image of the dragon. Okay? Many, many, many Celts were taught and very comfortable with the idea that the power of the universe is best represented by a dragon. A dragon is essentially a serpent with wings and feet. And so what Patricius did was shift that notion of where the power is from the serpent, the dragon, to the divinity that he called God the Father. So that's another possible explanation. The third explanation has to do with the idea that the serpent is the symbol of temptation. You know, Adam and Eve, remember that serpent? And what Patricius did was say, no, there is no division. There is no good and evil. There is only good. And the Celtic Christian has a very different idea, and it's based on this fundamental distinction. There is only good. There is only good. So something to be aware of. Patricius, St. Patrick, a holy man, a mystic and an alchemist, reintroduced the truth that if God is omnipotent, if God is omnipresent, if God is good, there can be no evil, no power called evil. There is only one power, and it is good. And that appears to be what he brought onto the earth. An interesting concept. So that's the 17th. And then we go through the 19th, 20th, 21st, pick a day, the beginning of spring, the vernal equinox. Can we have that picture? Can you turn on the TV for me, please? We're going to do the back up on the slide to the previous slide.
Any lights on or off?
It doesn't matter. We're going to the planets one.
Let me see from the back. Yes.
Okay, not that one. Can you make it go backward? No?
Is this the one?
We're going to look at all of them. One more. Two more. One more. There we go.
Okay.
Does everyone know what an equinox is? Oh my goodness, that came out awfully.
Is that what you
Wow. That's not what it looks like on the computer.
still see it though?
All right. So let's go back here. Does everyone know what the equinox is?
There.
All right. We have the point at which the axis of the Earth is such that equal day and equal night. The solstices, as it goes around, the axis changes. So the North Pole is focused toward the sun at the summer solstice, and the South Pole is focused toward the sun at the winter solstice. Okay, and halfway in between are the equinoxes. Thank you. So. Yeah, I'm sorry that's so ugly up there, because it really is very pretty on the computer. All right, so one of the things that happens when we start to not be afraid of what's out there, we start to realize that we're part of the interconnected web of life. Okay? And if we shift it back to the other way, when we start to realize we're part of an interconnected web of life, we're not afraid of what's out there. And so instead of having
Man in dominion.
we have humanity at the center, or somewhere woven in there, which then, if you go to that next slide, when you're in man and dominion, you get this thing called, the earth falling apart. And when you realize we're part of it, you get this wonderful connectedness of all beings, mutual support. And one of the things that I'm loving about this time right now, how many of you are watching, as I am, the interspecies things that are going on, where the lion is literally lying down with the lamb? Amazing things where dogs and deer are good friends. The most recent one I saw was a doorstep in Colorado, I think I talked about this last time, where there was a dog and a cat bathing in the sun, and leaning against the dog on the bottom step was a deer. Wow. All right. Wow, there's something wrong with our connection, I
I think so too. We'll figure it out.
think. All right. So, the interconnected web of life says if you get rid of any one thing, you're getting rid of everything, basically. If you get rid of the rabbit, you're not supporting the mountain lion or the hawk, and they're helping to support the trees and the grasses and whatever. And all of these things are interconnected. You can't get rid of any one thing. We're inclined in our culture to think if I get rid of the coyote in the mountain lion, I'm doing a good thing. Yeah. Has anyone been to the Grand Canyon? You know that plateau outside the Grand Canyon that surrounds the Grand Canyon? That was a forest 100 years ago. And you see remnants of it today because, well, the National Park Service thought there were too many coyotes. So they killed all the coyotes, which meant there was nothing controlling the deer population, which meant they ate everything in sight until they can't be supported by the land that's there either. And so now there's only a few deer. Well, someone figured out about 10 years ago we could reintroduce some coyotes here. And now there's a bit of a balance, and you're beginning to see the forest return, the Grand Canyon. But that's just the classic, that's the Kaibab Plateau deer story, all right? Our web of life is very fragile. If there had been snakes in Ireland, and if Patricius had removed them, Ireland would not be what it is today. Because the snakes have a role to play in the ecosystem. And so if we go, and you can see it there, but if we go to the next one, yeah, back, there you go.
I'm working it.
Each of the critters, each thing that is growing is not only contributing to the other critters and the other things that are growing, but it's contributing to a nutrient cycle, including the nitrogen that we breathe. By the way, most of the air that we breathe is nitrogen. Yes, we need the oxygen for the blood system, but it's nitrogen in the air that is the carrier, if you will, of the oxygen. All right? So if you're getting rid of certain kinds of things, let's say we decide we're not going to let the animals deposit their wastes on our pasture lands. Well, guess what? Then we have to import something else because those grasses are not going to grow, and that corn is not going to grow, and that soybean stuff is not going to grow without the nitrogen, without the stuff that the animals leave behind or the people leave behind. All right? We forget these things. We think we can just change something, and it's not going to have much of an effect, and literally every single thing we do has an impact. Every single thing. And every single thing that's out there affects us. And that's the other piece we forget. So that gets us to that last one. There we go. Everything on the earth has a purpose. Every disease has an herb to cure it. Every person a mission. This is the Indian theory of existence. I'm a woman in the Salish tribe. Yeah, the Salish. Thank you. We can turn it off now. That is just too ugly. I wasn't going to do it that way, but I couldn't stand it. So when we recognize that the world is changing, like spring is happening, there's something that's happening inside us as well as around us. And that's something that in our culture we forget. We forget. We are a part of this whole process. So I'm delighted to hear a rebirth of a marriage. That is so cool, because that is so much a part of what this turning of the year is about. A rebirth of what seemed to be dead. Yeah? Yeah. And we all have favorite signs. You know, when I was a little girl, I was growing up in Chicago, and I lived in a, actually fourth story, officially third story walk up on a concrete yard, concrete walk, concrete sidewalk, a little bit of strip of grass between the sidewalk and the street. And between the brick wall and the concrete on the side of my building, every year, right about now, lilies of the valley would sprout. Yes. They were the symbol for me for spring. They were what new birth out of what looked like no possibility of life was about. We all have something like that. There's a favorite plant, a favorite tree, some place that tells us, it's spring. And there's something in us that begins to wake up. Something in us that's ready to move on to new levels. Remember spring fever? We don't talk about that much anymore. You know, because it got tied to something called puppy love. But spring fever is that awareness, oh, there's life, there's possibility, there's opening, there's something new emerging in me and around me, and I am part of it. Our urban empire culture wants us to forget that. We are cogs in the bureaucratic machine. Show up, do what you're assigned to do, and go home and consume. That's what we are taught to do, taught to be, and that's what we are expected. And then we get to retire. And for most of us, it takes from 6 months to 6 years to figure out how that looks. We might come up with a few part-time jobs because, what do you mean I'm not supposed to show up and fulfill a function? Isn't that what I'm here for? Spring fever is when, for a brief moment, we kind of forget that we're cogs in a bureaucratic machine, and we realize, oh, I'm a living being. I'm part of life, and that's good. Well, so that takes us partway through the week, and then we come up on the next couple of days. And the 21st has historically been, and now it's the 25th of March, called Lady Day. Now, part of the reason it's called Lady Day is because in Northern Europe, it's when the lady, the goddess, is returning, Ostara. And the church adopted and adapted. But then the church said, but wait a minute, this can't be so, because, these being men, childbirth takes 9 months to the day. So therefore, the Feast of the Annunciation has to be March 25th, because he was born on December 25th. So they shifted Lady Day to be the Feast of the Annunciation of when Mary was told she was going to have a baby, when she was conceived, when Jesus was conceived, March 25th. It used to be the spring equinox. Right? So we have this wonderful, wonderful week where we start with Patricius, the father of the people, and we end with the mother of God, Theotokos. The carrier of God, actually, is in the Orthodox tradition. God carrier, Theotokos. Wow, what a powerful time. What a very powerful time is there. So I invite you to be aware not only of the ecosystem of which we are all a part all the time, but of a long spiritual tradition, recognizing the newness, the beginning that this is, the beginning of something that was never possible before. This is a new now. Nothing from the past need get in our way. This is the head of the year, and anything that we have been or done that separates us from the divine has been released. So all that power that is everywhere present, that all indigenous people can feel, and we can learn to feel, is available to each and every one of us now to create a whole new way of being for ourselves and for the whole world.